Hello and welcome. The Nigerian President Muhammadu Buhari made his 2017 budget presentation to the National Assembly on Tuesday. He tagged it the budget of consolidation, and we are here to dissect that budget and see how it affects our lives. And with us to do that is Mr. Henry Boyo, a foremost economic analyst. Welcome, Mr. Henry, to Sahara Reporters.
Thank you very much, Kilechiko.
So, 5 months back, we had the budget of recovery and economic recovery and growth. It was a 7.414 trillion naira budget. How far has the government gone in implementing the budget of economic recovery and growth?
Thank you once again for the opportunity to make these comments. There are two components to every budget, the recurrent aspect as well as the capital aspect. Invariably, you will find that there is never a problem with implementation of the recurrent aspect because that's your salaries and emoluments and what have you. But the problem usually occurs with the implementation of the capital budget. In this particular year, 2017, for example, over almost 2 trillion naira was budgeted as capital expenditure. But unfortunately, there are reports that only about 450 billion have so far been released. Again, I think it was the Minister of Finance, or was it even the President, who indicated that the 450 billion so far released will be supplemented to a level that would be at least 50% of the capital budget for 2017. In other words, between now and the end of the year, which is just about 45, 50 days away, the government is going to spend another 500 billion naira. And of course, there are serious implications to introducing such a deluge of cash into the system within such a very short time. You could jeopardize the attempt to keep inflation below 15%, as the monetary authorities seem to be doing at the moment.
That's a prospect to be afraid of. But the recovery growth plan, or the two budgets, that's the 2017 and 2018 budgets, are centered around the economic recovery growth plan. How far do you think they have gone in implementing some of their very lofty projections, like 7% revenues from non-oil sectors and stuff? How far do you think they've gone?
Well, it's no secret that the government itself has come up to say that they have had problems with revenue collection, and consequently, they have come up with all sorts of ways to expand the tax net so as to be able to increase revenue. But unfortunately, the funds are not coming in as quickly as required, and consequently, there's this constant requirement to borrow. But then you should be very careful that you do not cripple the economy, particularly in the future, with an unbearable debt burden. So you wonder whether the government itself has not heard anything about what they call a balanced budget. You run a balanced budget, it means that you are making sure that your expenses do not exceed the income that you legitimately will earn. But if you continuously, year in, year out, extend your consumption and expenditure well above your capacity to earn, and this continues as a tradition, and you are not making any serious moves to arrest the situation, but you keep assuring everybody that, look, the debt burden is not a problem, we can handle it. But how can you handle a debt burden that already compels you to use over 50% of what you earn to service existing debts. So you must be worried if your annual budgets are purely founded on debt funding, and especially if debt funding is even being adopted for recurrent expenditure. It's as bad as that.
You touched on our debt burden, and it's been a concern for many, including CSOs. We are expected to borrow about 1.69 trillion this year, if this for 2018, if this budget gets passed as it was presented. What impacts would that have on the sustainability of our debt profile?
Well, as I mentioned earlier, it is a perilous situation when you already use 50% of what you earn to service existing debts. And if in the 2018 budget, you are also expecting to add anything from 7 to 15, 20 billion dollars to your debt burden, you will be touching very quickly almost $100 billion.
Sorry, but what's the GDP ratio, debt to GDP overall for this year? I think it's about 1.7% or thereabout. What's the overall figure like debt to GDP?
You are absolutely right. It's below 2% according to Mr. President's speech. But if you follow the debt to GDP ratio, you will be grossly misled in the sense that in practical terms, it is absolutely inappropriate and unsustainable for you to earn 1 million naira as income in a year. And out of that 1 million naira, you spend 500,000 naira to pay your existing debts. You haven't paid for transport to work. You haven't paid for children's school fees. And then somebody says, well, it doesn't really matter. You still have an opportunity to borrow. So because at the end of the day, your debt to the total productivity in your household, for example, is still modest. I think that would be certainly bad advice, because whoever tells you that is trying to lead you down over the precipice. If you have not created avenues for additional tax revenue to supplement the funding budget, to fund the recurrent expenditure as well as the capital budget, you will have a problem in subsequent years because you will still continue to borrow in order to spend. And it will come to a stage where you may require over 90% of what you actually earn in order to service your debts. So you are caught in what is normally called a debt trap. And that appears to be where some people are consciously and deliberately leading us to. And that's rather unfortunate because we exited the controversial 2006 Paris and London Club debt burden. And no one in their right senses would probably have thought that just over 10 years later, we would be in a worse situation. When we cried about the Paris London Club burden, the total debt we owed as a country was just about $30 billion. Okay? Today, we owe over $60 billion. And you're saying we are still going to borrow in fact, we borrowed to fund the 2017 budget. Like you have rightly observed, it's projected we'll borrow another 1.5, 1.6 trillion naira in 2018. Who knows, we might borrow 3 trillion or more in 2019 or thereabouts. So at the end of the day, the younger generations to come, may not say very good things about our capacity, our ability to maintain financial prudence in the management of the nation's resources.
There are analysts who believe that this year's budget is flat because it's a 16% increase from 2017, and the inflation rate has been hovering between 15 and 17%. Well, you've been saying we don't need to borrow, but we need to move this economy. How ambitious is this budget?
The, the issue of ambition does not even arise because the budget does not have a direction. And that is the reality. A budget with direction would first of all assess what you can legitimately expect to earn against what you need to spend in order first to stabilize your debt situation. When you see, I find it of great concern that a lot of Nigerians put too much trust in the capacity of annual budgets to revamp, re-energize, regenerate the economy. This is unfortunately is not so. The budget by itself has very minimal power to transform the economy, because look at it from this point of view. First of all, the 8.66 trillion naira, which is being celebrated as the biggest ever budget in Nigeria. When you consider in real terms, the 4.4 trillion budget of 3 to 4 years ago is probably of greater value, because at that time, the exchange rate of the naira was around 150 to 160, okay? But when you now have the current situation where the exchange rate is about 305 to 360 as the case may be, and you're talking of a budget of 8.66 trillion, you're really talking in real terms value of maybe 50% of what the nominal value says. So really, you cannot celebrate the size of budgets. If size of budgets could really drive an economy systematically or steadily over time, you will find that the budgets have been increasing year in, year out, but the poverty on the other side has been deepening in spite of the increase in budgets. So the reality is that the real sector is where the game is for transforming the economy. But the factors that drive the real sector have been totally ignored. Somebody asked me yesterday, said, what is in it for the common man? What is in this budget for the common man? The easiest way you can reach the common man is by making sure that you cannot throw money at him, but the money that he has in his pocket, let it be possible that he can buy more with it. A question I've asked people at various seminars is this: how many of you have been directly impacted by the Boko Haram insanity? And nobody puts up their hands. And I said, how many of you have been directly impacted, adversely by the Niger Delta militancy? Nobody put up their hand. Then I said, how many of you have gone into the market, whether Jankara Market or ShopRite, and by the time you come out, you see the little bag you're carrying, and you wonder whether somebody has stolen your money, And everybody put up their hands and say, yes, we're all affected by this. In other words, the masses, everyone in Nigeria is affected by the value of money, okay? So when inflation is celebrated or adopted as acceptable at 15%, and hopefully will go to 12 point something percent, without defining the process of bringing inflation from 15 point something percent to 12%. And what is the main driver of inflation in any case? Excess supply of money, okay? So when you now have a situation where you are stressed by the burden of excess supply of money, as a tradition in this country, burden of money is already, excess money is too much. And then you now increase your budget to spend more. In other words, you have increased your budget. That means you are going to what? Increase the problem of excess supply of money and make inflation also very difficult to handle. So in that regard, you will find, that is why I said the budget really has no direction.
Wow. But there are things like cost inflation, and the government needs to spend a lot on infrastructure. And here you are talking about spending cuts and austere measures from what it seems. Wow.
Well, you see, the reality is, as I've told you, the total amount that's available to government for spending every year, this year is what? 8.66 trillion. How much is 8.66 trillion? You're talking of maybe 27 billion dollars. Whereas in real context, the power sector alone is speculated by experts to require over $100 billion, okay? And your $24 billion in your budget is not all for capital expenditure. 70% of that is recurrent expenditure. So you have a situation where power alone requires $100 billion. Maybe aviation requires another $50 billion. Maybe shipping requires another $50 billion. So you'll find that if you are putting your hope on government's annual budgets to drive the economy, it will take forever. You will never get there because the total requirement is too huge for God. That's why I said the private sector should be the driver of the economy. The amount of funds available in the private sector for investment is infinitely elastic if good policies are there. You've seen how badly government manages infrastructures and things like that, the refineries, the roads, and all this. Why should you want government to keep spending? For example, this year I think we have a total of about 500 and something billion in 2018 budget being allocated for housing, power, and what's the other?
Yes.
Yeah. You know, that's saying that you are. Let's assume that each of those three sectors get $500 million. $500 million in injection into power, into aviation. I mean, you realize that it really doesn't make sense to put your hope on government budgets to drive the economy. So the reality, as I've said, is open up the space for private sector, either in the areas of concessioning that doesn't cost you any money. The people come use their money, they do what they have to do. You see, the private sector doesn't just walk into a space and start operating. You must create an enabling environment for them to operate in. And part of the enabling environment, of course, is that in the first place, it all starts with consumer demand, okay? Without consumer demand, nobody wants to invest anything. If there's no consumer demand for bread, you don't produce bread. You won't have bakeries, and bakeries would not employ people. So it is based on consumer demand that investors would react. And when investors react, they expect also to be able to get value for their investments. In other words, it's difficult for investors to operate in an environment where they have to borrow at 20-something% or thereabouts. And it's also difficult for investors to operate when consumers constantly have the challenge of depleting purchasing power of incomes. If you are earning 100,000 naira a month and every year your purchasing power or the 100,000 naira loses 15% annually, in 3-5 years, you would have lost more than 50% of your income. You wouldn't be in a position to be able to buy as much bread, as much milk, as much yam, as much gari as before. And that happens across the whole board. So what do you think happens to the people who produce these things? You see, I said very specifically, the government cannot produce, redeem our expectations for enhanced infrastructure. It has no business borrowing to try to do all this when the private sector can do it perfectly well at no cost and put people to work, people who would then subsequently pay taxes. The companies themselves would also pay tax. That is how it works elsewhere. But if you think that, next year the government is going to spend 10 trillion, so we should celebrate again, you are deliberately and consciously deceiving the people, because it is quite clear that incremental increases, incremental budgeting does not necessarily or has never really led to improved social or infrastructural welfare.
Okay, let's quickly breeze through some of these indicators. 2.3 million barrels per day for crude oil. How realistic is that? Last I checked, the government was hovering between 1.8 and 2 million.
It's not for me to say how realistic. How realistic would depend on the political climate in the next 12 months. But you see, the truth, of course, is that the same question is asked year in, year out. The output for oil is projected at 2-point-something million barrels a day. Prices are so much and all that. But you know, I find it very disturbing that there appears to be no agency that is bringing all these things together so as to be able to see the pluses and the minuses. For example, in this particular year, we know that the multiple exchange rates have prevailed within the economy. The CBN has had to sell dollars for as low as $200 or 200 naira per dollar, and officially sells at 305, and also sells at 320 or 340. There are all sorts of pluses and minuses as a result of that. Nobody's accounting for those. We just believe that, the total foreign exchange that we earn, which has been captured by CBN in the first place and auctioned against the naira, unfortunately, because you see, we do a lot of crazy things. We expect, for example, that the naira exchange rate would appreciate, especially when we use a model that is self-defeatist. You see, the model of auctioning dollars against the naira is itself a limiting factor. In fact, it's a degrading factor to the exchange rate of the naira, because see, anything that you auction, you expect to sell it to people who pay higher and higher amounts. When your own central bank is betting against its own currency, by auctioning an alternate currency against its own currency in an environment that is admittedly suffocated with excess liquidity of naira, it is a crime.
305 naira. Is there implicit subsidy being paid on power and petroleum products?
They haven't said they are paying any subsidy.
But we have an artificial exchange rate of 305 naira, and we have an I&E window of 316 naira.
Well, I think you are directing the question at the wrong person. I'm just as ignorant about these things as you. 1 minute they say they are not paying subsidy, on the other side they say they are paying subsidy. They say no, they are using a modulating system, and then you have this at what rate? Exchange rate, like you rightly said, are they using to pay for the supplies of petrol and things like that? If you're using a lower rate of 305 and you're selling at 360 or whatever, it means you are basically subsidizing the price of petrol. So that's why I'm saying that the whole system has not shown.
And not just petrol, sorry. There's the power purchase agreement where for solar, it's 11.5 cents to $1. At what exchange rate would that be? Also for the gas guys, at what exchange rates would that be?
I accept these are some of the controversies, some of the contradictions within the system. I listened to a gentleman who represented the disco companies 2 or 3 days ago I think it was on television, and he said, look, you cannot get power adequately if you're not prepared to pay for it. That the 35 or 30 something per kilowatt hour that they were collecting at the moment was at least 50% short of what they should be collecting, and that was the reality. You see, you have made a very important point. Unless we recognize the impact of exchange rate in almost everything we do, and recognize also that the naira exchange rate does not have a history of ever appreciating, even when we have surplus dollars that we sell deliberately, consciously, our own CBN sells there, and even allocates to borrow the change, despite the clear recognition that most of the channels for corruption have been funded by the purchase or the trading of dollars with borrow the change. You'll find that we are not truly making any effort to move forward. The things that concern the common man, as I said, first of all, improve the quality of the income they earn. I'm not saying double the income. You double the income, you worsen the situation, because inflation will take away everything. So the thing to do is to work towards the position of improving the value of what they already earn. In other words, let the 100,000 naira you earn today be able to buy what 200,000 naira could normally buy. That is you are adding value directly to their lives. That is the most important, significant way that you can touch everybody's life. Inflation, bring it down to 1 or 2%, as happens in successful economies everywhere in the world.